Dear all, welcome to the AVO ETH Social Justice Seminar Series of 2021. I'm Rosa, pronouns is she, her, and I'm happy to moderate today's session on using quantitative and qualitative methods to uncover nuances of disabled experiences in higher education by Dr. Margaret Price. Each year, this seminar series concentrates on a theme to create scholarly opportunities to learn more about social justice. We hope participation in the seminar series stimulates your curiosity and interest to be deliberately inclusive in your administrating, leadership, advising, mentoring, and teaching. Deepening your understanding of disability is important for everyone, and it is essential to promote the growth and evolution of ETH, in addition to the newly green barrier-free project at ETH. If you have any questions or comments or would like to become more active or involved in the social justice at ETH, please reach out to us through the diversity@avoeth.eth.ch email address, or go to the AVO ETH website where you can find more information on this year's seminar series. We are happy to this year offer 4 leading experts in disability studies who will virtually join us at ETH. Our first speaker was Dr. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who talked about how to build an inclusive world the last week. And today we are happy to have our second seminar, which is given by Dr. Margaret Price, whom I will introduce in a moment. Our third seminar is entitled The Academic Blazon Genesis Accommodation and Design by Dr. J. Dolmach, which will be on the 16th of November. And our final seminar entitled Against Ableism in Teaching and Scholarship by Dr. Stephanie S. Rosen on the 30th of November from 5 to 6, again, as all of the other seminar series. We will be happy to, if you join us at the other ones, you can scan the QR code here to get the link to the registration. Now, next I will share a few guidelines for today's sessions. There will be multiple communication and material formats for the seminar. We will record the event and make slides available shortly after the live seminar. And as you notice, there will also be automatically generated transcription in English during the session, which works okay, but is not entirely accurate. Please bear with us for this. This will also be saved as a transcription that we will edit and make available shortly after the live seminar. You can type your questions into the chat box in English or in German, and we will then read the question aloud to the speaker in English during the Q&A session. While the chat is accessible for some and even a preference, it is also a barrier for some people. So questions after the seminar can also be shared directly with us through the diversity email address, which can be found on our website. While we do not anticipate it, any hateful or harmful comments will not be accepted, and the individual will be removed from the Zoom room. Guidelines aside, I want to personally thank all of you for joining today, and the entire AVO ETH team, and especially Mark, for making it possible to organize this seminar series. Without further ado, it is my personal pleasure to introduce our second speaker of the 2021 AVO ETH Social Justice Seminar Series, Dr. Margaret Price. Dr. Price's pronouns are she, her, and she joins us today from Columbus, Ohio in the USA. Dr. Price is an associate professor and director of disability studies at Ohio State University, where she also serves as a co-founder and lead PI on the Transformative Access Project, which reimagines access as a collective process that centers race, ethnicity, disability, class, gender, and sexuality. Her award-winning research focuses on sharing concrete strategies and starting necessary dialogues about creating a culture of care and a sense of shared accountability in academic speeches. Her book, Made at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability and Academic Life, won the Outstanding Book Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Other writing appears in Inside Higher Education, Disability Studies Quarterly, Miss Magazine, and Karos, a Journal of Rhetoric, Technology, and Pedagogy. In 2017, Dr. Price was introduced into the Susan M. Daniels Disability Memorial Hall of Fame. And in 2020, she was awarded a Fulbright grant to study Access and Design at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Today, we are incredibly fortunate that Dr. Price will share with us details from her mixed method studies, which include surveys and interviews regarding disabled faculty in higher education. She will talk with us about the different kinds of knowledge that are built through these different methodologies. Key questions that we will touch upon today are: what motivations and experiences drive disabled people's decisions on the job? And what do disabled people know about working in higher education that non-disabled people need to know? Hope you are as excited as I am to learn from Dr. Price how quantitative and qualitative methods can work together to build robust knowledge about disabled experience and how this knowledge could lead to create access for all. Please address your questions and comments to Dr. Price or to me using the chat box function, and we will get to them during the Q&A session. For now, I'd like to give the word to Margaret. Please begin whenever you're ready with sharing your screen. I will now stop sharing mine and looking forward.
Thank you so much, Rosa, and also Mark and everyone who's here as part of this very impressive seminar series. I'm truly honored to be included. I noted when we were talking about putting questions in either German or English that I speak a tiny bit of German, but the only time I have occasion to use it anymore is when skating with my international friends during the Athens to Atlanta road skate every October. The most recent time I tried to have a conversation in German, I was helping someone who had fallen, and I was able to say phrases such as, "There is a van coming for us," and "they will have medical supplies." And I discovered on that occasion that that's probably the limit of my German anymore. If people would like to put questions in the chat, that would be wonderful. I'm also happy to answer questions while I'm speaking. When I have my PowerPoint up, I can't really see very much that's happening in the Zoom, but Rosa and Mark have promised to keep an eye out for raised hands or questions or anything else that might mean I could pause for a moment and we could go to a question or just address some problem that's occurring along the way. I'm planning to speak for no more than 30 minutes. I'll keep a close eye on my watch and then we'll have some time for discussion. Rosa, I just want to check in before I share my screen. Is there anything I forgot that I should attend to before I launch?
Nope, I think you're ready to go.
Okay, great. Today, I will talk about a study that I've been conducting since 2013. This study focuses on the experiences of disabled faculty and other employees in higher education settings. The cover slide shows a screenshot from the study's webpage. And for those who'd like to look around at a broader context while someone is speaking, you're very welcome to go to this webpage and just kind of explore some of the information about the study. The page is at my professional website, which is Margaret Price, all one word, .wordpress.com. And you just click on the tab that's labeled Disabled Faculty Study. So I'll pause for just a moment for those who might need to get there. Very briefly, to review existing research about disabled employees in higher education, there's not a lot. There's more since 2013, but the picture is still not abundant. Disabled employees in higher education are rarely studied systematically. The studies that do exist tend not to cite one another, in part because they're spread across a wide range of disciplines. This leads to the research record being what one researcher called fragmented. Now, interestingly, there are many, I would say over 100 at least, that I've found individual articles or chapters or very small N studies, like 2 people, 3 people, things like that. And an interesting refrain that I've found in those accounts from individual people or very small studies is that the author or the participants feel completely isolated, even going so far the research on disabled faculty. And the most recent study of this kind that I found was published in 2020. Larger studies, a few do exist. They tend to exist not in US research. I've found one that was conducted by the UK Guardian. There are also some larger ones that are conducted by the US National Science Foundation. The World Health Organization has some research, but these really tend to be mostly nose counting. That is, how many people do we have that we can identify through some not very nuanced metric as disabled? Okay, it's not enough. What should we do? They tend to underplay the complexity of the issues involved. For example, the emotional toll of trying to obtain and keep accommodations, which is something I'll talk about in more length a bit later. An interesting anecdote arising from the survey of 267 disabled faculty that my colleagues and I conducted. When we tried to publish this article, we actually completed data collection in 2013, and we were ready to send our article out by early 2014. However, our article was desk rejected, that is, not even sent out for review, by 4 different education journals. All of the editors told me personally that studies of disabled faculty were outside of the scope of their journals. One of the journals actually specializes in disability and higher education. Again, that picture has changed a little bit since 2014. But it's still very common to see people assuming that research on disability in higher education really just means research on student, not any other inhabitant in higher education contexts. That study was finally published in the journal Disability Studies Quarterly in 2017. So given this highly fragmented picture, one of my foremost research challenges when working on this study was even figuring out what questions to ask, and also even trying to find samples for the 2 studies, the survey and the interviews. So in my talk today, I'm going to offer an account of how this study came to be, with special focus on its methodology, because the methodology had to emerge along with the study. In a sense, we were learning as we went. And the main question I'll focus on is this one. How can we ask better questions about disability in higher education in order to solve long-standing problems such as achieving greater inclusivity? So some brief background about the study. As I mentioned, the study was launched in 2012 as a collaborative effort between me, Stephanie Kirschbaum, Mark Salzer, and Amber O'Shea. Mark and Amber are both psychologists. Mark is a rehab psychologist, and Stephanie and I both work in rhetoric and composition, which is partly a humanities and partly a social science discipline, but rhetoric scholars tend to be located in English departments, as Stephanie and I are. Mark and Amber were both at Temple University. I started out at a small college called Spelman College, which is a historically Black college for women. I moved to Ohio State in 2016, and Stephanie, during her time working on the study, was located at the University of Delaware. The survey had 267 participants. It began with a relatively narrow focus, looking only at faculty who self-identified as having mental health histories. When the study went to the interview phase, we decided to broaden it to include faculty who self-identified as having disabilities of any kind. Now, it's important to note that the process of this study has been quite slow, as you can tell, since we launched it 9 years ago. One reason for the slow pace is that the methodology had to be adjusted in response to our own positions as disabled researchers, but also in response to our findings as they emerged. This was one reason why we gave up the narrow focus on mental health disabilities and broadened to disabilities of any kind. It became evident through the survey that trying to draw a bright line between mental and physical disabilities wasn't really leading us to the kinds of questions that most needed to be asked. We also had to take into account the fact that several of the researchers, including myself, are disabled. So we did the interviews in various modalities, including face-to-face signing, phone calls with an interpreter or captionist, a face-to-face kind of hybrid of speech and signing, a video conference with just oral speech, like we're doing now, instant messaging chat, email, and various kinds of these. In every case, researchers deferred to participants according to their preference for modality. And this is a very common directive in qualitative research. Always try to defer to your participant. Make sure your participant is comfortable, meet in a location that works for them, use a time frame that works for them. But interesting thing that we found as we were conducting interviews was that our own disabilities inevitably shaped the interview situation. So the mythical objective qualitative researcher wasn't really a story that was possible to sustain over the course of this study. And Stephanie and I published 2 articles talking about that in more detail. Price and Kirschbaum, 2016, which is in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, and Kirschbaum and Price, 2017, which is in the journal College English. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about how we selected participants. For the survey, since the survey had to be completely anonymous due to regulations from our Institutional Review Board, we did opportunity to sort of try for any kind of sampling other than convenience sampling. And we also didn't have any way to link survey data to interview data. So that kind of triangulation, which would be really valuable for future studies, was not something we were able to do for this study. For the interview study, we decided pretty early on that it would be useful to use a method called maximum variation sampling. That means recruiting participants or simply selecting participants off the list who represent as wide as possible a range of experiences and situations. So the 36 interviewees in the disabled faculty study self-identified with a very wide range of disabilities, including blindness, deafness, mobility impairment, paralysis, mental illness, chronic pain, cognitive impairment, chronic illness, and others. Interviewees also self-identified with a wide range of races, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, classes, ages, and fields of studies. They also work in a wide range of academic appointments, including non-tenure track faculty, tenure track faculty, tenured clinical positions, staff positions that included instruction, and in a couple of cases, graduate students who were students only at their own universities, but also worked as adjuncts at other universities, essentially in order to pay the bills. Now, if you're accustomed to an approach to sampling that is much more systematic and aimed at representative samples, this can seem pretty chaotic. So the key question for this kind of sampling, maximum variation or diversity sampling, is not to aim at who is representative of a particular group. The idea is not to uncover typical experiences. In a sense, it's to go in exactly the opposite direction and ask the question, who is unimagined? Who would be thrown out of a representative study as an outliner? Whose experiences might be incomprehensible through present frameworks? And our assumption, or not our assumption, but sort of our hunch, our hope, as we went forward with this kind of sampling, was that working with this sort of sample would allow us to ask better questions. We already knew from our early work that we were being surprised by things that our participants were telling us, and we decided to go forward on the assumption that there was much more to be told, but we didn't yet know quite what to ask. I'll also mention that the idea of being an unimagined type is from Tanya Tichkowski's wonderful book, The Question of Access, which was published in 2011. I want to mention one other thing about this study that is perhaps not unique, but certainly something that was a significant research challenge. The question of keeping participants' identities confidential. In the US, it is rare enough for a faculty member to be disabled, at least to be known as disabled, that simply describing the briefest details of a particular person's profiles would often be sufficient to say who they are. So for example, if I described one of our participants, this is a fictional profile, as a wheelchair user and linguistic scholar who teaches at a small liberal arts college in the American Northeast, those few details alone would probably be enough to identify them. It's that rare to see faculty using wheelchairs. Or to take some other examples, it's that rare to have blind colleagues. It's that rare for a signing non-speaking deaf person to be working full-time in a faculty position, or for that matter, in a staff position. So this issue of potentially identifying information was discussed with each participant. And each participant has come up with their own bio, in some cases identifying, for example, one of our participants chose to identify only as a woman of color and not to be more specific about her race or ethnicity. But it was also very important for her to say that she identified as an immigrant to the US. So we always deferred to how participants wanted to identify themselves, but we really noticed that a seemingly unexplored issue in working with disabled academics is that there are a lot of us, statistically speaking, but we are hard to find in the research. And if we are findable with our disabilities, we are suddenly kind of luridly findable. Everybody knows who we are. So I'll talk just briefly about the survey analytical process. The analysis was conducted using SPSS. Amber O'Shea did most of this analysis with the rest of the research team contributing questions and specific combinations to analyze. Most of our findings, because it was a first of its kind and convenient sampled survey, are descriptive in nature. Some of the things that we were surprised by and thought we needed to follow up on more closely included over half of our 267 respondents reported that they did not request accommodations, despite the fact that they were entitled to them. Over half of the respondents also reported not even knowing how to request accommodations at their institutions. And we also, one of our major findings was that the vast majority of our respondents reported that their most important supports came from off-campus resources, such as personal friends, spouses, mental health supports that they pursued separate from their jobs. So these kinds of findings led us to some of the questions we were able to ask in the interview phase, including the question of why disabled faculty seem to have so much difficulty locating support at their institutions. In the US, this is supposed to be a straightforward process. It's driven by a piece of legislation called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you ask someone who's responsible for implementing that act, for example, a government official or a person at a university who is representing the university's interests in disability cases, you will be told that it's a very straightforward process. You will literally be told there are 3 steps: identify the problem, identify the accommodation that is needed to address that problem, implement the accommodation. However, over half our respondents on the survey reported many different kinds of problems, which caused us for the interview phase to want to say, what's going on in that process? The official is that this is a very simple process and legally mandated, yet it seems to go so badly, not just some of the time, but at least over half the time, according to the 267 people reporting their experiences on the survey. Incidentally, I'll mention that one of the factors that caused us to open the interviews to participants with disabilities of all kinds is that some survey respondents reported that their experiences seeking accommodations for physical disabilities did not go any better, which really piqued our interest. These were anecdotal data. There weren't enough reports for us to say, oh, this is a significant chunk of our respondents. But given that that reflected Stephanie's and my personal experiences as well, we thought that seems weird. If you have an accommodation need that is as seemingly straightforward as a sign interpreter will show up for 1 hour and interpret during a meeting, why does this so often go so wrong? Now, moving on to the analysis of the interviews, I'm not sure how many people in the audience are qualitative researchers, so please forgive me if I'm going over information that's already obvious to you. The qualitative coding method that I used, oh, and I'll mention that Stephanie decided to work on a different book project, and Mark and Amber were just on for the survey. So at this point, from interview analysis onward, this is me as an individual researcher. So my qualitative coding process draws from approaches including grounded theory, category construction, and situational analysis. The process for grounded theory of it, but essentially it involves an inductive process which the researcher identifies initial codes, just kind of trying to notice almost everything that seems to speak in any way to the research questions. Those are then grouped together or modified into what are called axial or focused codes. So here you have fewer codes, and ideally they're kind of matching each other in some sort of more parallel scheme. At which point you start to build a specific coding scheme where your codes are not only organized into specific categories, but the categories also work together to form some kind of larger picture. The categories don't exist in isolation. They're part of a dynamic unit. So it took me literally years and years to eventually develop the coding scheme for these interview data. Part of the reason is that I just am not funded very well. Most humanities researchers in the US are not. And part of the reason is that the findings themselves were just surprising and were emerging slowly. Ultimately, I developed a coding scheme that includes 4 major categories. In some qualitative coding approaches, these big overarching categories would be called dimensions. And then the specific categories within them are called codes. You could also call the big categories codes and the littler categories subcodes. Doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent. So the 4 major dimensions that I ultimately arrived at are cost, time, accompaniment/relations, and space. Each of these dimensions includes between 10 and 16 codes, and some examples of specific codes that I'm coding for within these interviews are within cost. One code is cost of accommodations, that is, how much do they literally cost in money. Use of personal resources by the participant, who pays for what when paying for accommodations, missing events or losing things, and then there's another series of codes there. Within time, some of the examples of codes include pace, stamina, duration needed to get accommodations in place, time of day. Time actually is the most capacious dimension with 16 codes. Now, as you can tell from these particular examples, some of these are quite objective. Time of day is simply coded every time a participant mentions the time of day in the context of something else they're talking about. However, the code duration needed to get accommodations in place is a little more subjective and requires a more careful definition. It reflects the finding that there's often a really significant gap between being granted an accommodation and actually having that accommodation be available and usable to the participant. And this sometimes involved quite a long story. So that was a code that required more interpretation. For this reason, when doing qualitative coding, the coding dictionary will typically include a strict definition for the code and some examples of data that would be coded that way. And here I should shout out my wonderful research assistants who worked with me over the years, Ryan Cartwright, Paige Mason, and Addison Torrance. So what did all this lead to? All that stuff, which was either fascinating to you or a real snooze, depending on your inclinations around methodology. My early codes provided an answer to one of my research questions, which was a very simple question. What barriers are faced by disabled academics? However, I had not expected that in investigating that question, my findings would force me to look again, sorry for the misspelling, at the question of what barrier actually means. So for example, many of the respondents in the interview phase of the study reported the same problem. This problem was that their everyday lives, and especially the choices they made about how they did their work, were extraordinarily hard to explain to their colleagues or to their supervisors. A disabled person, one of the faculty members in the study, several faculty members in the study described grappling with common sense questions from their colleagues. For example, why don't you just explain the problem you're having to your chair? Or why not just ask your students for help? And these interviewees, as they told these stories, identified one issue, which was, it's very hard to explain why this is a problem to my non-disabled colleague or my non-disabled supervisor, or sometimes even my doctor or my therapist. I found that interviewees often seem to struggle to explain these issues even to themselves. So one of the questions that was on our research guide was the question, if you could have any accommodation you wanted, what accommodation would you choose? And some faculty members being interviewed answered this quickly and readily. Oh, I'd like to have this and this and this. That would be great. But some faculty members paused when we asked this question and said, I don't know. And several of them said the same phrase, which was, I can't even imagine. And that really piqued my interest. That was what led to the major sort of investigation, which is underpinning my book, Crip Spacetime, which is there seems to be this kind of different reality, what I'm calling Crip Spacetime, that seems very difficult to explain or justify if you're not the one experiencing it. And I got very interested as a rhetorician in how people tried to explain this and how other parties to the conversation, or in some cases, unfortunately, disregarded those explanations. So here's a quick example of Crip Spacetime, and I'm going to go fast because I think I just have about 5 minutes left. The chart on the slide right now is something that I call the Accommodations Loop. And the way I arrived at this loop and its implications for disabled faculty is discussed at much more length in my article, Time Harms, Disabled Faculty Navigating the Accommodations Loop. It was just recently published in South Atlantic Quarterly. Essentially, this loop, if you can start anywhere, but we can start just for convenience at the upper left corner. The system itself is slow. This is already well documented. The process of getting accommodations granted is time consuming. There may be delays before accommodations are actually put in place. Figuring out how to use accommodations may be time consuming, or just arranging them may be time consuming. For example, numerous deaf faculty members had to arrange their sign interpreters every single time they needed them. And some accommodations are simply time consuming by nature. Americans are very fond of referring to a level playing field in relation to disability access, but this is really just a story. This is one reason why I'm interested in exploring space-time as a concept. Justice doesn't necessarily mean equivalence. So you combine that slow system with the fact that the employee's need might be quite time sensitive. They might need that reader immediately. They might be harmed if the air quality in their workplace is not redressed immediately, or a temperature issue is not addressed. And sometimes, as happens for all of us, a problem may arise suddenly and unexpectedly. That combination leads to two different kinds of costs for disabled employees. They may decide to pay for their own accommodations, or they may leave their job. Numerous interviewees reported both strategies. And another kind of cost, which is often unremarked on in the existing research, is that the person undergoing this loop, which is kind of more like a maze, is often experiencing significant emotional distress. And of course, that's a factor in when employees decide to either pay for their own accommodations because they just can't deal with the stress of it, or to leave the job altogether. Of course, that emotional distress can exacerbate the fact that the needs are time sensitive. And when employees decide to solve a problem on their own, either by paying for their own accommodations or leaving their job, this actually reinforces the slow system because the need appears to have disappeared. And I'll go to the next slide to kind of summarize what this diagram essentially means from a disabled employee's point of view. First, traversing this loop is not just time consuming. It exacts a huge emotional toll as well. Interviewees used words like devastated. Some cried during their interviews. Several interviewees, as I mentioned, have left academe since their interviews took place. In addition, and maybe even more insidious, the accommodations loop is generally imperceptible to those not traversing it. Disabled employees continue funding their own accommodations, or they find a way to manage the constant labor of justification and surveillance. I didn't go into detail about this, but many employees reported being really invasively surveilled as they tried to make a case for why they needed accommodations. Or they may simply disappear from the system. And when a disabled person leaves the university system, that loop closes and disappears. It essentially, poof, their disappearance removes both the need for the accommodation and also any trace of its history. So that's depressing. I'll get to the more cheerful part in just a moment. In summary, the analytical process for just this one dimension, time, suggests a possible answer to why inclusivity seems like such a difficult thing to achieve in higher education. Everyone's in favor of it. Everyone's working to achieve it, or almost everyone. But much of the process of exclusion is not perceptible to those who are not undergoing it. And even those who are undergoing it may struggle to say what is actually happening. We don't have language for it. We don't have the discursive framework that would allow us to say, this is what's happening. And that's what you really need the qualitative research for, is to get to those things that cannot be replied to on an instrument such as a survey. So in conclusion, the disabled faculty study demonstrates that we are often not asking the most pressing questions about access in higher education. For example, a frequent question that we ask ourselves and each other is, how can we make environments in higher education more accessible? How do we remove barriers? How do we write better policies? How do we support disabled students better, support disabled employees better? But over the years of analyzing the data from the disabled faculty study, I realized there are other questions that might lead us more directly to the heart of the problem. First, almost no one in higher education is against inclusion. A great deal of effort and money have gone into making higher education more accessible and inclusive. But why then are our efforts not working very well? The situation, of course, is highly variable during different countries. The US is not well known for knocking inclusion out of the park. And it's also, of course, variable along lines of race, gender, sexuality, type of disability, and so on. So the book that I'm working on talks about these issues using an intersectional framework. For the purposes of this talk, I'm looking mostly at a US higher education context where despite sweeping legal mandates for accommodation, a huge number of almost unnameable problems arise. The second question that I think we need to explore is, why do disabled employees in higher education routinely report a sense of working in a completely different world or according to completely different logics than their non-disabled mentors and colleagues? Interviewees reported being asked common sense questions like, why didn't you just come to me? And struggling to answer those questions for their colleagues, their supervisors, and also for themselves. And finally, in closing, in order to find and explore those better questions, I've offered a couple of examples, but by no means have I nailed down all the better questions about inclusion in higher education. We really need a wide range of methodologies, and we especially need to collaborate using the methods and methodologies that we do have. Thank you very much.